Hey guys, welcome back. Today I've got a bit of a different video. As you can see from the title already up there, I'm touching on how to be a better player at nights. I've seen both Alex and Bobo have done something in relation to this, and like their tips on how to improve and stuff. But this is going to be a little bit of a different direction for it because I feel like both of those guys are going to give you better tips on how to actually improve as a player. But what this is really focusing on is how to be someone people want to play against at the table. So I'm just going to get into it. This will take me... Oh no, it's easier than I thought. Okay. So first, it's pretty obvious. Don't lie about stuff. Don't cheat. Don't specifically try and trick your opponent by something they don't know about your list or something. Don't sort of... If you're talking about your list at the start of the game, don't sort of go really quickly over your characters hoping they won't notice their kit out so that they fall into some trap during the game or something. Don't do stuff like giving yourself more veil tokens or moving a few extra inches or any of those things where you get to those little points in the game and you're like, man, I really wish I could have one more inch because then I could wheel this little bit more and you wouldn't be in my flank. Something like that where it's I'm so close to being okay here. That I'm so close to getting out of this bad situation that I found myself in. And there's always that little temptation to be particularly it's harder on UB because everything's sort of logged and everything. But on the tabletop, there's that little bit your opponent's generally not staring at how you measure and stuff. You might be able to get your way out of it with just a little bit of dodginess, but just don't. You got to stop yourself even that temptation when you're like, shit, I really want to win, and this is just so small. Don't do any of that stuff. Kind of obvious, but when you've got a small scene, it comes across the players who do that sort of stuff, who, when you sit there as an opponent, you haven't maybe measured everything, but you're looking at it going I don't think this will work. And every time they just get out of a situation or anything like that, where it's it comes around because you play the same people, you hear the same stories. If you're repeatedly being dodgy in some way, it's going to come around and it's going to be your reputation and everyone's going to know about it. So don't do it because people won't like it. I should have actually said at the start, I've structured this in do's and don'ts. So we're starting with don'ts and then we're going to do and then alternating every time. What I've got here is do, play to intent. So it's really shitty when you get one of these games where your opponent is sort of really stringent on measuring something exactly when really for the interest of time you can do things all right, I'm going to place this here, he's a millimeter out of 18 inches, so he's out of your charge range. And then it turns around to their turn, and they're like, oh, well, look, it looks to me like on my tape measure, you're just touching 18. It speeds the game up, it makes everything easier, and it makes the whole experience nicer if you can literally just go in that situation, well, I'm out of 18, so not chargeable here. And then if you measured it and you end up being 16 inches away, it's well, shit, I've measured that really badly. Go for your life, you can charge me, that's fine. But if there's a millimeter or two in it, just go yeah, well, we already discussed that. We didn't want to sit there for an extra minute making sure it was exact. We're saving time. It's not going to affect the game, the fact that maybe it wasn't in the exact right position. Same thing for line of sight and stuff. As far as I'm concerned, near enough is good enough. Particularly if you see someone measuring something. As soon as you've seen them measure it and put their thing out of line of sight or something, you should just know that that's what they were meaning to do. So even if you bring out your laser pointer and oh, I think I can just see you, it doesn't matter. There are sort of some occasions where this isn't really applicable. So sometimes there are things that are just really close, so the millimeters matter. It's I don't know if I can get out here, which is where the sort of playing honesty sort of comes into it as well. So someone can sort of move something somewhere and be oh, I'm just out of your charge range, or I'm just out of your arc, whatever, and that's fine. But sometimes they can't get out. So it's not necessarily don't measure things closely if it benefits your opponent for them to be in a better position. But it's just, like, if I've got March 14 and I move 10 inches and say, yeah, he's just out of your line of sight here, but facing you down your flank or something, don't then go like, oh no, like, look, I can see his corner, that's still fine. Because realistically, in my turn, if I'd been being like more careful or something, I'd be like, well, I'll just place it an extra half inch over. I had the movement to do it. There was no issue with it. It was just, I'm not trying to spend 45 minutes every movement phase. This is a big one for me, but it's like something we can all, like, we all fall into it and we can all get better at it, basically. It also is one of the things that helps you get better at the game in general, but don't complain about dice. So if you get unlucky about something, even if you've got shit luck the entire game, don't sit there whinging to your opponent, because it doesn't feel nice as an opponent when the person you're playing is whinging about your luck and stuff the whole time. A lot of the time, because from my experience, it's wrong. You know, people complain about dice and they're not really thinking about the whole course of the game that it's happened over. So a lot of the time, you know, you'll fail an important check, but it's like, well, you didn't really complain about the fact that you passed 3 2-dice casts in a row where you needed to roll higher than 9 on all the dice. Like, we don't generally seem to remember the times when we got really lucky with dice, but we do remember the times that we got really unlucky. So, for a better game in general, we should all just try to complain about dice as little as possible. There are sometimes, obviously, it's a matter of how you do it sometimes. So, if you go in with your super lord who's got 6 attacks, he's hitting on 2s, he's wounding on 2s, and you don't get a save, and he does 1 wound, it's like, don't sit there and go like, oh shit, like, that's bullshit, you shouldn't have been able to survive that, this is ridiculous. But do have a laugh about it and go like, fuck, like, that guy sucks, man, like, what's going on here? Like, sometimes it is about how you do it, but don't just whinge about the fact that the dice didn't fall your way. Like, it's something that is just, it's not enjoyable for your opponent, because it sort of takes away from their feeling of accomplishment. And just in general as well, if you don't complain about dice, you might start focusing on the things that you've done wrong. Like, oh, I failed that March test. Well, maybe you should have put him within 12 of the BSB, given that it didn't matter. So that can also help you become a better player. But it's much nicer for, really, I think both of you. Because if you're not sitting there thinking that the world's against you or your dice are going wrong, you're also just going to have a nicer time, even though things are not coming through. Particularly, one that annoys me as well, because you see it on UB, it's a little bit less common with sort of regular dice rolling, because you don't see the exact numbers for everything. But, like, I had a situation the other day where I had 30 throwing weapon shots, hitting on 5s, and I rolled like 20 hits. So that's a ridiculous amount of hits to get. But then I rolled below average for wounds, and he rolled above average for saves. So the end result was below average wounds caused by the throwing weapons. And it's the sort of thing where a lot of people whinge when you roll those 20 hits. But you really just have to wait. Like, if you're going to whinge, at least wait until the end result and go like, oh, yeah, shit, okay, everything's balanced out. I'd prefer you didn't whinge at all, but if you're going to whinge, at least don't do it on a single dice roll that hasn't actually affected anything yet. Next one. This is like a bit of a bugbear for me, and it is a little bit different at top tables as opposed to lower tables. So a lot of the time when you're playing really high up, people are more worried about not making a mistake than doing anything particularly clever. So they're going to spend 30 minutes each movement phase making sure that, like, everything is exactly perfect. They've measured out all the arcs, they've measured out all the lines. I think that realistically, if you want to have good games of ninth, you need to have a mind on the time. This is actually, I mean, it's a little bit relevant to like casual home games when there is a time limit or something, but it's more relevant to tournaments where you've got like the, 2.5 hours or 3 hour hard limit of that's when the round ends. Because it really sucks, particularly as, like, I'm a guy who plays combat armies. It sucks when I play a ranged army when they get to turn 4. Because all that does is benefit my opponent. And often that's come about because he's taken so much time to go, well, you're a combat army, I need to make sure that I don't give you any, like, openings, I don't make any mistakes here. so I'm going to spend ages measuring everything out, but at the end of the game, I might be in a great position. He's had 4 turns of shooting me and I'm about to start carving him up, but we've run out of time because he's played so conservatively the whole time, making sure he doesn't make any mistakes. I think basically you need to sort of, when you're playing a game because you're against an opponent and it's their experience too, you need to keep an eye on the fact if you're taking up too much time, you need to speed up. If you can't measure out every arc exactly, overcorrect. So you go like, well, maybe instead of spending 5 minutes figuring out if this one model can get out of your arc, go like, well, I've spent 30 seconds looking at it. I don't think I can, so I won't. I'm going to do something else. Take a less optimal option because you can't take 30 minutes for all of your movement phases. It doesn't work. It means that you run out of time. Some people obviously use this to their advantage, and that to me falls more into like the first thing of like don't cheat, because some people are specifically trying to take more time so that you don't get to them. But other people are just conservative by nature. They're not really doing it to gain an advantage. They're doing it because they're sitting there going like, no, this is how I have to play well. I need to check all these things, but there are ways that you can adapt to that, which is basically like overcorrecting yourself, where you're like, I'm not going to spend so much time trying to figure out if I can do this exact movement. I've checked a little bit. It doesn't look like I can. And often, if it's super, super crucial, sometimes that's like, this is the one I'm going to take time on. But other ones where you're just like, oh, I'd like to, but if I can't get out of arc, I'll just move backwards instead. Just do that. Like, speed up your play, even though you know that maybe there was a chance that you left a better play on the board potentially. Because it's both of your experience, and if somebody's coming in with, particularly, like this is particularly relevant to combat armies versus shooting armies, but if you're taking a shooting army, you need to be particularly mindful of the fact that your opponents are there to get into combat. That's what they're playing to do. That's what their enjoyment in this game is coming from. And it's really selfish if you sit there and you just go like, well, that's fine, because all I care about really is winning, and I'm going to take all the time I can, or all the time I need to, because there's nothing that stops me in the rules. I won't get into chess clocks because I hate the idea, but culturally, people just need to realize there's someone else playing this game, and I need to give them as much time as they give me. If your opponent's taking, if you're playing a shooting army and the opponent is going, oh, I need to make sure that I can, get cover here or block line of sight here, and he's taking ages, then you take ages too. Like, you don't need to worry about it. If he's taking ages, then stuff him. Like, it's not your fault if his movement phases are taking 30 minutes. Doesn't matter. In fact, you may then be warranted to be telling them to hurry up if you're like, no, I want more turns to shoot the shit out of you. But yeah, basically, if you're the slower player in a game, you need to overcorrect yourself. I had a game at Masters last time I ran, so 2019, where we had the army swap, and I was running Demons, which I didn't really have much experience with, and my opponent was running KOE, which was an army he actually ran. I think, no, he didn't take it to that tournament, but he'd taken KOE to plenty of tournaments. So he had a pretty good idea of how his army worked and like what the stats were and stuff, but I was a lot more sort of confused, basically, and I made a big mistake on turn 5, I think. Basically because of that lack of familiarity, I think I charged a Maw, and then I went, wow, the Maw is actually not that good. He's not as good as I thought. I just thought, big model, he should win this, and I overestimated him. But there was something on the board, I think, basically, where in turn 6, because of a mistake I'd made, he would win the objective, and we had like 3 or 4 minutes left to do both of our turn 6s, and he was sort of like, oh, this, we've taken a while, like, if we don't finish it, we don't finish it. But I was sitting there going like, no, like, I've taken more time than you, like, for sure, I've been the slow player here, and if we don't finish 6 turns, it's a massive disadvantage to you. You're losing, like, I think it was going to kill a unit, so it was going to be like 4 or 5 points because of the objective as well. Like, you need to, like, we're going to finish this, so I'm going to speed up. And we managed to finish it out, which was obviously a huge disadvantage to me, but because I was the slower player, that's the way you need to think. You need to overcorrect yourself. If you get to the end of a game and you've only gotten to turn 5 and you've been slower, there are often times where you can go, well, in turn 6, you would have killed that unit and you would have killed this unit. So I'm going to give those to you because it's my fault we didn't make the time. I know I've been slower. And yeah, basically another thing, like time is another thing where you will sort of get a reputation if you're slow. And people will talk shit behind your back about the fact that you're slow. And there will also be whispers about, is it dodgy? Is he trying to get an advantage? So realistically, if you want to have fun games and have opponents want to play you, keep an eye on your own time. Another don't is complain about lists. Because similar to complaining about dice, it's just shitty if you sit there and your Gortak has charged through and done really well. And you've played, I've played like maybe 150 games with Gortaks throughout the course of 9th. I know what they're good at and I know what they're bad at. But then you play one guy who doesn't have the tools for it and they're sitting there telling you about how broken it is and how it's ridiculous that it's so strong. It's like, it's less fun for you to enjoy your models and your units doing well when your opponent is whinging about how broken they are. And it's another thing that we can sort of all fall into the trap of basically going, this is ridiculous, this army's overpowered, it's stupid to play against it. But 9th is so balanced compared to any other game that I've ever played. 9th is so balanced. 99% of your issues, if you're losing games consistently, is your play. It's not about your lists, it's not because all your opponent's lists are really good, it's your play. So stop whinging about their lists. If you've got an army and you're playing, Beast Herds against Dread Elves, but really all Elves, and you're really unhappy about the fact that you keep losing to Elves, it's not necessarily the Elves' fault. Like, Beast Herds have a whole lot of problems with the fact that they're a very RPS army. Dread Elves particularly are really good against them because of the +1 to wound and the striking first. Like, you've basically got 2 glass cannon armies and the Dread Elves strike first, so generally speaking, the Dread Elves will win that matchup. But that's not the fault of everybody else. You need to address your own list and the problems that it has in dealing with opponents. Because there's nothing out there that is so crushing the meta that it's completely overpowered. Like, High Elves were super underpowered 2 or 3 years ago, according to the results. And then Furion and Scrub started taking them again, and they figured out a good list after there were some buffs to the army. But then they were the strongest army for that year or something. So you can go from being the worst army, get 100 extra points basically from points decreases, and then you become the best army. But normally it's just, that's just basically player skill that influences that as well. So obviously the 100 points matters, but it matters way less than how you play the army. A do, this one is starting to get a bit controversial, I think. I think my last 3 points are some people will disagree with. But I point out obvious mistakes. So if because oftentimes I do it and a lot of my opponents do it, you sort of talk through with your opponent what you're thinking, where you're sort of so if I charge them, I might break them and overrun into him. Okay, that's all good. So if there's something you see that is just very clearly a mistake by your opponent, he's going in and you don't he's expecting to break you, but you're stubborn or you're unbreakable or something. I would always go, hey, I'm actually stubborn here. So they might still do it because they might be disagreeing, they might not be seeing what you're seeing, but I like to remind them when things aren't necessarily obvious about my army. If they're putting a unit and they're measuring the flank distance between a unit of Wild Horns and their unit, I will remind them at that time, I do have Swift Stride to your flank and your rear with my Wild Horns, so because that'll affect where they want to put their unit. One that came up in a game against me, which I was really shitty with, and I shouldn't have been. I wouldn't say I threw a tantrum, but I wasn't happy with it, and I don't think I handled it well at all. But there was a charge that I made. I had a static 7 block, I think, of Wild Horns with a Beast Lord, a BSB, and a Wizard in there, and I charged the Blazing Glory. If I broke the Blazing Glory, or I killed the Blazing Glory, an overrun of, I think, 4 would have taken me into the flank of a really big unit. So basically I was like, alright, sweet, I'm going to take this, I'm going to blow him up, and then I'm going to get into the flank and it's going to be huge. I I knew that the Blazing Glory could declare a challenge, but I didn't know that it was stubborn in a challenge. So when my opponent declared a challenge, I accepted. Basically, just sitting there thinking, it's fine. I've got enough static res that basically you'll have like a leadership 3 test and you'll pop regardless. But none of my characters were good enough to kill a Blazing Glory. Like, they weren't that strong. So I did 2 wounds or something. He maybe did a wound to me, but then he was stubborn. So the obvious thing there, if I was the Demons player, is I would have said, he will be stubborn if you accept this challenge. Because even if I declined the challenge, I would have still, like, unless I got very unlucky, it would have still been a win by like 5 or 6. Just because of my static res and the fact that my unit was like buffed up defensively, and I maybe did a wound. Like, he could either turn off my BSB or turn off my Beast Lord. Beast Lord would do more wounds with the BSB, adds the static combat res. Realistically, like, it was a terrible decision, and it was obvious that it was a terrible decision to accept the challenge. So in that position as the Demons player, I would have pointed out, knowing that I will be stubborn, because it looked like, I think that it's a feel-bad moment when your opponent like fucks something up because they didn't know, because they're like, oh, well, obviously I would have made a different choice, and you haven't outplayed them, you haven't done anything clever, you've just omitted information that was relevant to them, and you can't complain too much. So my mistake in that situation when I got shitty was the fact that, like, I should just know. I should have looked at the unit before I charged in. I should have thought about this. I should have looked at the unit before I challenged. Like, I accepted the challenge. Whatever it was, like, you can't blame your opponents for them not telling you some bit of information like that. But I think that it's a much nicer experience for both players when you're both playing in the spirit where you will mention things like that. Because then as well, when you get to, like, at the end of the day, we're all sort of, like, winning doesn't mean that much. Overall, we're all kind of playing to win, but looking to get better at the game as well. And you're not getting better at the game when you're only winning things off tiny little, like, mistakes that your opponent shouldn't have made, basically. If your opponent charges your Death Star, or if your opponent charges in with a monster and you've got the Vermin Swarm Doomblade and you're like, I'm definitely going to kill it. Remind them that the Doomblade guy is there. Because you don't want to win on those things. You want to win because you've played better, not because your opponent hasn't known about something in your list. But I definitely know some people will say that's stupid, you shouldn't do that. And it's all your opponent's fault if they don't know something about your list or your models. Don't, this is another controversial one, play boring lists. It's just shit. Like, I mean, I just talked about High Elves and the fact that they're, like, you shouldn't complain about lists. Well, I'm actually complaining about lists. Here we go. But it's a little bit different maybe because I'm not like in a game and talking to someone directly. But no one really wants to play your Dwarf Gunline that sits in the corner. No one really wants to play your High Elf Seaguard Star that sits in a corner and then charges you with a Griffin character once you get close. It's not a fun experience. No one wants to play someone whose army is designed to sit in the corner. You should be playing armies that want to actually play the game and require skill to use. That's what people want to play against. That's what makes it more fun for everybody. And you don't demonstrate any skill if you can sit in the corner and roll dice until your opponent's dead. Like, that does nothing. That just that doesn't really show that you're any good at the game. All it does is show that you've got a really strong list, which you may not have even written yourself. So just don't be a corner Charlie, as the Americans call them. Play a combat army, actually do things in the game, and win the game through your own play rather than by just rolling dice at your opponent until they disappear. This one, I think, is probably the most controversial, and I've got some examples to bring up in regards to what I mean. When I say play to your opponent, I mean, if you're playing at the top table of a tournament, you pull out all your tricks. You go like, all right, well, if I move my champion here, I can deny your character attacks. If I turn my unit in this way, it means that you're only going to get a couple of models touching me when you charge, which means that you can't charge me or I'll win. But when you're playing on the, like, this, I mean, if you're playing someone who is of lower skill and knowledge than you, so oftentimes, like, if you're a strong player and you go to a local tournament, often like your first or your second round might be against someone who's less skilled, knows less about the game, maybe has a worse list. I don't think that you should be pulling out all of your tricks in those moments. So I've got 2 examples I'll bring up here. So over here, I've got Barb Chief on a Chimera. And I've sat him in front of a unit of heavy infantry, which, I mean, whatever. The units don't really matter. But the positioning here, you can see the Barb Chief is keeping the Barb Chief is keeping the heavy infantry in his front arc. It's a little bit hard to tell from where those things are, but he's an inch away. So basically, when they charge him, they're only going to get 3 models in contact. Whereas, I mean, it's a little bit, it's not the best example of this sort of thing, but whatever. Whereas if you were maximizing normally, you'd be able to get 4 models in contact. I would say that if you're a strong player playing on, that often plays on top tables and stuff, and you're playing a weaker player or a newer player, don't do that. If you are going to put your Barb Chief in front of them like this, either allow them to maximize properly. You may show them the other thing. You may go, look, this is something I could do, but I'm not going to do that here. Just put him in front like this, or don't put him in front at all. Just go, no, I won't block that unit with my Barb Chief. I'm not going to do that. Because basically all you've done here, if you're sitting, I'm not going to get the position exactly right anymore, but whatever, there-ish. Really, you're exposing the fact that your opponent doesn't know that you can do that a lot of the time. Or you're exposing the fact that you've got single models and they've brought blocks because that's how most people see 9th Age when they start, and then they realize that single models are really powerful as they get better. But when there's a skill disparity, you shouldn't be winning on things like this. You should be winning on your macro game. You should be like, I've got a stronger list. I know where to put my units to take advantage of your list. That's how I'm going to win. I'm not going to win on little tricksy details like this. Maybe a little bit different if it's a big list disadvantage, where you've got a list that matches up really poorly against theirs. It might be a bit different. But in general, I think you should avoid that sort of thing. Over here, another sort of trick that you can pull that I saw recently in my team's tournament. This is a random mover. So he was facing this way originally, whatever. When you pivot him, like that, probably works. Probably do it even better. Not quite. Hang on. This is great TV. So you pivot him so that he hits like that. So because he hits the unit before he hits the impassable terrain, yes, looks like it, he declares a charge. So you take him back to his original pivot point, and then he does the charge as normal. So again, because of that, and this time because of the impassable, he's blocked on his wheel by the impassable like that. So when he charges, he's only going to be able to get 3 guys in contact. Something like that. Again, I would say in this instance, if you're the better player and you're playing with his Forsaken one, alright, eventually we'll come back. There we go. You should just go like this and go, I'm going to charge you normally. I'm not going to catch you out on something that you didn't know when you were placing your unit next to that terrain. Obviously, a lot of people strongly disagree with this, but if you're playing against a weaker player, you shouldn't be relying on things like this to win. So I think you're going to have your opponent is going to have a much better experience, and you will learn more from the game if you're not pulling off these tricks when they're sort of easy to pull off. So when your opponent doesn't know that they can happen, you shouldn't really be doing them, I don't think. Sometimes you'll catch people out because they won't know what'll happen at a top table or whatever, and that's fine. You're both playing at the same level, and you've got an advantage in that area. But when you're playing against someone who doesn't know the game anywhere near as well, I think that you should tailor your play and the way you do things to make it more inclusive, so that, if it'd be better if I had a whole diagram or something up on here, but so that basically your overall game strategy is what wins you the game, rather than little tricky things like that. Or like my chariot characters, how you can't strike the opponent in the character in the second rank with anything, like any close combat attacks. Melee attacks that are distributed can hit him, obviously, but if I was playing against someone who, if I took that list to a tournament, I was playing against someone who's weaker, the things that I would often consider doing are, one, I'd split the 3 character chariots up, even though it's a weaker way to play them. I think it's going to be more fun for my opponent than just having this Death Star that he's definitely going to underestimate and probably lose a very valuable unit to. Or if I do want to keep them together, I will run them 3 wide. So obviously it's not a good idea for me to have my Druid in the front rank because my Druid is pretty vulnerable. But having him in the second rank is this annoying little trick that I think would create situations on the table where my opponent's sort of like, oh, like that's stupid. Like I don't like that. Like that's the way it works. Whereas, I mean, people will still think that at higher levels, but I think when someone is sort of still learning or someone is just not as good at the game, you shouldn't be relying so much on those like niche little rules that might win you the game at a higher level. Because also in this situation over here, where you've declared that you've made the charge that it's like here, your opponent will also be really shitty about the fact that he can't even get within 1 inch of there to complete it against you. So you can use the terrain against him and he can't use it against you. Will definitely frustrate him. And I think when you've got that skill disadvantage, you just need to be mindful of the fact that you can probably take that little bit of a handicap where you don't use all the tricks in your arsenal to make the game more enjoyable for you and your opponent. Obviously, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that. A lot of people are going to a lot of people are definitely going to disagree. Whatever. I don't know what it's going to do. Okay, just keep going. Like people disagree with 7, people disagree with 6. It's gotten more controversial as we went along, but these are my definite points that came to mind when I thought about making this video about basically how to make other people enjoy playing their games against you more. So hopefully this has been a little bit helpful to some people to sort of think about the way they play, particularly if you're trying to grow a scene rather than just dominate all the competition on the table. If you're trying to get more people in, these are things that will help make newer players enjoy the game more against you. And a lot of these things are things that will just make your games more enjoyable for your opponents always, because you're being a nicer person, basically. So I hope it's been helpful in some way. I'll see you on the next video.